Hi, and welcome back to Continual. Tonight it's time to hoist the sails and open up those warp drives. We're going to be talking about the navies, both at sea and in space. I'm your host, Jim Nettles, and let's go around and see who else is joining this little fleet of brigands. Layla, you're up first.
Hi, I'm Layla Dorine. I write LGBTQ fiction and romance, and it's great to be here tonight.
Kristin?
My name's Kristin Jackson. I'm a graphic designer, work mostly in the film industry, and I enjoy reading science fiction, naval adventures, and that sort of thing.
Dennis?
My name is Dennis M. Myers. I'm the author of the Rise of the Automated Empire series. In my youth, I spent 10 years in the United States Navy on submarines, which is why my hero ship of the series looks vaguely like a submarine. In my books, the military action goes all the way from a skirmish in the first book to all-out war in book 4.
Nancy?
I'm Nancy Northcott. I write historical fantasy, sometimes with and sometimes without strong romantic elements for Falstaff books. I also write several different kinds of romance, and with Jeannie Adams, I write the Outcast Station science fiction series.
So let's start talking just a little bit about, what do you like to see? Is there a favorite sort of military sci-fi, something that has these fantastical elements, whether it is on sea or in space? And there was a book I was trying to find and pull back out before I did this, and I could not remember the name of it, that was actually set in both, where there was a whole water world, a little bit of land and stuff on it, where a lot of it was set at sea in these nice skimmers and everything else. But a lot of it was, the story started and ended with flying in via the spaceport, getting there, finding out you're on a backwater planet, and having a lot of fun. And it was a great book. And there's a lot of other fun ones. So Layla, is there a favorite for you that you like to read or see, watch, whatever the case may be?
Yes, actually, so I grew up on Navy bases. I was a Navy brat. My folks were Navy. And I grew up hearing stories of how when they were stationed in Yokosuka, Japan, my mom and dad met at the Naval Hospital there, but they met and married on the USS Midway. So, it was always a cool story. And then we've got the newspaper clips and everything. It was back in 1972, 73 when they got married on the ship. And so, growing up on bases, they have the bookstore. And I was in there trolling one day, and I came across Robotech, the Macross Saga. And they had the SDF-1 and the big ships, and I'd already watched the cartoons, because I'm on Guam at the time. So we're right there. We're getting all the animes that's coming out, and Robotech just happened to be one of my favorites. I grew up loving the mechs. I wanted to fly planes. I'd been in several. And I loved the idea of them launching them off of these space battleships, these transforming, really cool battleships. Well, and of course, being a Navy family, one of our favorite games to actually play was Battleship. So imagine how thrilled I was when the Battleship movie came out, because then I had all of that, to watch. And then we got Pacific Rim. So I love the whole idea of the battle mechs, the changing carriers, the mechs that can fly and they can float, and it's just like they give the Navy such options, especially with the aircraft carriers, because you can just picture all the things the carrier itself gets to be, not just the ship that everyone lives in and the battleship, but then it transforms and it gets to carry a sword, and then there's all the cool planes off of it that fight too. So I love anything that's kind of set in that Navy world of destroyers and battleships, and just the cool air to sea battles and air to sea what's underneath it and exploration. It's just a cool genre for me.
Kristin?
Yeah, well, I brought a prop of my favorite. It's Jack Campbell's. He has a series called The Lost Fleet series, and I'm very grateful that he wrote, it's a number of books in the original series, and then he wrote, a prequel and several sequels. So there's lots of books to enjoy. Yeah, I just, I've also grown up in and around the Navy. My stepdad was a Navy Master Chief. I'm between two naval bases, and I worked for defense contractors with the Navy for a while. And so just those stories that are set in the military settings. I mean, everything from Star Trek. I mean, I was an early Star Trek brat. I'm probably 7 years old when I first found it in the reruns on the after school television. That became my go-to thing before I went outside to play, is you watch episode of Star Trek and then Doctor Who, and then you were outside. Ooh. So her homework was in there somewhere, but that was like less of a priority. But yeah, just, space fleet, space adventures. I'm more of, Pacific Rim. Yes, I really enjoyed that movie, but I tend to be more out in the stars for my adventures. But yeah, I mean, it's just such a fascinating approach to writing, where it's easy to do sequels and prequels and series, but when you have a space-based Navy type of for the setting for stories.
Mm-hmm. Dennis?
Well, I grew up with that old show with the sea view, the submarine with the big windows and the flying sub. That and Star Trek. That's my naval experience before I actually joined the Navy. Imagine my disappointment when I found out that real submarines don't have windows, because below about 400 feet there is no light. So you really have to marvel at these things, how they travel around the ocean blind, using nothing but sound. And because the kind of submarines I was on were boomers, the ones that were trying to hide, no active sonar. It's all passive sonar. And yes, that did mean that occasionally they bumped into a sleeping whale. And then while I was in the Navy, the biggest the book that I read was Hunt for Red October, which it's not billed as science fiction, but it's that drive that the Russians were using, that's science fiction. It's enough for me. But between that and the movie version, the book really impacted me, because part that got cut out for the movie was the parts that took place on the Ethan Allen, which was the same kind of submarine that I served on. So when they talked about walking around on the mess decks, I could see that because I was there. And then, of course, when I sat down and started writing, I knew from the outset what my series was going to do, and I knew I needed both the Marines and the Navy. And when the two books were split, I left some of the Navy in the first book, but the Marines were almost entirely put starting in the second book. But by the end of the fourth book, you're very familiar with the ship and the crew, as they rotate and change. And the biggest thing for me in writing that was remembering what it sounded like, how the people spoke. IC communications, you know that phrase, right? It's how you speak in a command language so that you are clear who's speaking to who and what the order is, and you get the response so that they got the order. And so writing that way was just a whole lot of fun. Drove my editor nuts, though. Not enough commas, she said.
Nancy, how about for you?
Well, my parents also were in the Navy. Although they were out of the Navy by the time I was born, I grew up hearing stories about their naval service. And like Layla's parents, they met at a naval hospital, only this is the one in Memphis. And they were actually not married on an aircraft carrier, which would be really cool. But so I grew up hearing about the Navy and about my parents' period in service. So I was always interested in that, and that kind of branched out to a wider interest in military history, but the Navy in particular because of my parents. And I like contemporary, sort of semi-realistic, like Red October. I really enjoyed Hunt for Red October, but I also like futuristic Space Navy and others, and movies like The Final Countdown, which kind of blends the two. Because for those who are not familiar with it, an aircraft carrier goes through a time warp on the ocean and ends up near Pearl Harbor on December. I think that they land there December 6th, 1941. And when they realize where they are and when they are, then this sparks a debate because the Japanese Zeros have nothing that can manage the tech, that can meet the tech on this aircraft carrier. So the question is, should we stop the attack on Pearl Harbor? What do we do? And I thought the debate was really interesting. And I like the way in military stories, there's often a conflict about what's the right thing to do or what's the best thing to do, and sometimes, what the people higher up want you to do. And you get that in different contexts in a lot of stories, but usually in naval fiction, naval movies, or any really military ones, the stakes are so big that it really adds juice to the conflict. And I guess we could call Battlestar Galactica a space navy because it had a fleet, even though a lot of those ships weren't like battleship capable.
Right.
So those are the things I like about it. And the first series I remember loving that was futuristic science fiction was David Weber's Honor Harrington series. And that is Navy complete with command structure and all the rest of it.
Hmm.
So, Kristin, I'll go to you on kind of this idea. What is it for you, right? Because again, these stories cross a very wide swath. We go from everything from pretty modern, pretty realistic sort of scenarios, Battleship the movie, notwithstanding, but I'm still a little pained on some of that. But what is it? Is there a genre, or is there kind of something in that you always want to see in something that has these very naval, very militaristic elements for it? I mean, we were just talking about Battlestar Galactica. Again, it was very structured, it was a very structured, very military sort of society, trying to work with how do we deal with civilians that are on ships, which looks a lot like things that we deal with today. Or do you like something more like the Star Trek sort of a world? If we look at Star Wars and the Imperial navies and things that we see, or the Imperial fleets that we see there, is there a particular one that speaks to you more, that you like more? Is it more the realistic? Is it more the fantastical? More structured, less? What do you like in those?
Let's see. I guess there's several things that I usually that make a good story for me, and one is like what Nancy was saying with the questions of right and wrong versus, the regulations that people have to operate under. And especially when you're talking about, space, these guys are, if you're putting yourself into like a real headspace for these guys, they're out in the, far distant light years, hundreds of light years away. They're not going to be able to get an answer from their command center structure back home. So they have to really wrestle with moral questions out there and do things pull together or fall apart if you're facing difficulties. And another thing that I really look for in stories is a sense of realism, like a Star Trek, as opposed to Star Wars. Something I think that was really well done in the Top Gun Maverick movie is when they were showing the air combat. And so you have the Russian fighters coming this way and you have the American fighters going this way, and they are just miles apart. It's only like a split second of contact. And then they're miles away from each other. So one thing I really like about Jack Campbell's Lost Fleet series is that as a military person himself, he understands about fighting and taking that dogfighting in a realistic sense in his space battles. So he does a lot of space battles and does them very well. And the preparation of you're flying at 0.2 light speed in this direction, and the enemies are coming from this other direction. You're only going to have a fraction of a second of contact. So, you look at this. I love Star Wars. I love the movies. very much. But you have like dogfights, and they're all swirling around, and it's almost like they took planetary physics and just did it for space vehicles, which is visually beautiful. But if you're talking about, like, if you really thought about it, the space battle is going to be much more done by computers as the two fleets blast past each other at, a combined percentage of light speed. And then they'll be on the other side of the solar system by the time round 2 comes around. So, I kind of appreciate authors and writers who realize something like that and write it as part of their story, because for me it really helps ground it.
Dennis?
For me, Battlestar Galactica, I thought was good in how the command structure was allowed to change occasionally when the Pegasus came in, and after the aftermath, they promoted somebody new to the captain, and people shifted around a bit. Whereas on a show like Star Trek, the crew tends to stay put for the entire run of the show. So for 7 years of the Next Generation, the only person that got a new job, Worf and Geordi, and everybody else stayed the same. On Voyager, it's a running joke that Ensign Kim stayed an ensign for 7 years. Let me tell you something. In the U.S. Navy, if you're an ensign after 7 years, they're not going to accept your renewal. You're out. There's something wrong with you. But for space battles, I got to hand it to Babylon 5, because their fighters acted like they were in zero gravity. They would, zoom past, spin around, fire the other direction. All of that was really, really good, except it mostly took place in one plane. There wasn't enough of this going on for my taste. I want, every single direction, because space is crazy that way. So when I wrote my battles, my ship is a missile cruiser. So its primary weapons are missiles and by the end of the series, drones, which they just launch as many as possible and get them out there, and the weapons themselves seek the targets, either advised which targets to focus on, but they go and find the targets and destroy them, while the ship then tries to get out of there because it's dangerous.
Nancy?
Well, any kind of story for me has to have might for right. And sometimes what's right is up for debate between the people who have to do whatever it is that's in front of them and the people who are calling the shots. So I like that aspect of it. I can't really pick between contemporary realistic and science fiction or futuristic stories. I like when there's a clash about what should be done, because then the person making the decision has even more at stake. That's really common in Mike Shepard's Chris Longknife series, which I like a lot. And he is not a veteran, but he grew up in a Navy family, so he grew up kind of steeped in that culture. And I think sometimes we look at what feels realistic to those of us who have never sat in those chairs versus what is realistic to people like Kristin, who have experience with it, and people who know, and Dennis, who's been there, and Layla, who's grown up around that and I'm sure absorbed a lot of it. So, and you run into that a lot of time, no matter what kind of story you're writing. It's like, what is the reader expectation, whether it is realistic or not? And if you're going to decide not to meet the reader expectation, then you have some dancing to do, I think. But I really like the Chris Longknife books. They feel realistic to me, whether they are or not. And I really like Elizabeth Moon's Vata's War, about Kylara, I'm not sure you pronounce it, Vata, and her Serrano Legacy, because those are both futuristic military science fiction with space navies rather than boats. And I'd like to also finish by giving a shout out to Taylor Anderson's Destroyermen series, which is World War II ships go through something in the ocean and get transported to this alien world. and they have to figure out how to survive there and how to make alliances there. And oh my goodness, lo and behold, some Japanese ships came through too. So it's kind of a mixture of they're fighting their own war, but they're also caught up in the war between the different species and cultures that live on this planet. And so I thought it was a really effective use of different cultures. And, you can't give me a good explosion. And a lot of the times I'm happy. So I actually will finish instead with Destroyer Men of saying, I like the movie Battleship because the U.S. Navy kicks alien butt and there's lots of explosions. I mean, really. So I'm done now. Thank you.
And it exploded.
Layla?
I love books that are actually set on the ocean. Growing up near water, I have a love of the ocean. We were stationed in Florida. We were out in Guam, out by the Philippines. So I'm used to being by water. And I love the idea that only a small percentage of the ocean has been explored. So whether it's, the Meg and what was that, Mecha Shark versus Mega Shark, the Navy plays a huge part in that. And what's the one with like the guy from Urkel? It was like Mega Shark versus Giant Octopus or something that he was on, where you never know what's down there. The Marianas Trench gets a lot of attention, but there's so many other explored regions. And, Guam is out there near the Marianas Trench. So you hear all these stories about what could be in the trench and how deep the trench is. And then, for me, I love mechs. So when you slide into, okay, we could have a giant squid down there. We could have a giant shark down there. Or we could have, a rift and we have the kaiju coming up and, we've got to build the mechs to fight them like they had to do in Pacific Rim. So you just never know. The Navy gets to have so much more responsibility for protecting the whole world because most of the world is ocean. And what can be out there in the ocean? Anything, any possibilities. So I love when they actually set the book in the ocean and give you that chance to be like, hey, there may be this, there may be that, until it comes up out of the water and you see like the boat sitting on the crown of the creature's head and half falling off because it's this gigantic, beast that came, this Leviathan that comes up out of the water. And now you've got these commanders going, well, do we launch jets at it? Do we try to launch missiles at it? What kind of damage are we going to do to the planet if we try to fight it with this means, that means? What are we going to do to the sea creatures? Like, are we about to do more harm than good if we try X, Y, and Z? We can't just like nuke the ocean. I mean, so there's so many things that have to go into their decisions on how to combat what comes out of the depths. And what comes out of the depths can be anything. And I think that's one of the coolest things. Like, as much as I like space, the ocean is really the same concept of this vast unexplored region. And as a writer or a filmmaker or what, I can look in history, I can look in sci-fi, I can look for all these ways to merge it. Give me I was at 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. That was one of my first loves for a movie. And you've got the Kraken. And, I had those books with like the ghost ships growing up. Like I had all these stories with ghost ships and all these ones of sea monsters and the giant Kraken that would sink these ships and what was in Bermuda's Triangle. And, you have all these places that can be explored and all these options for movies. Like imagine taking the Titanic and setting it over by Bermuda's Triangle and just having fun with what you could do with all of that. Mm-hmm. So many possibilities, and you don't even have to leave the planet.
There was a great book that you might enjoy. It wasn't really a military in that respect, but it was called Driving the Deep by Suzanne Palmer. She wrote a series of 3 or 4. I guess the most recent book was out recently, but one of the books featured going under the ocean moon of what was it, Saturn or Jupiter? It has
Probably
that
Europa,
ocean moon.
Europa,
yeah. So it, that was one of the key settings for that particular book. So it was very well written series. It is. It was like you're under a mile and several miles under the the ocean in the absolute pitch dark and what's down there. So yeah, it's good storytelling opportunities for deep ocean.
I put a little joke about Europa in my book. My books take place 1,000 years in the future, so they know what's down around Europa. And somebody made a joke about the disappointed scientist who spent, nearly $1 trillion to get the first probe down there, and all they got was one brief image of teeth.
Well, we all know that the best part of any story is the people, right? Regardless of the setting. But I think that a lot of the time what we see out of these stories that have that sort of a naval structure, that militaristic structure, and again, the people we get to see really a lot of the time and the structure they operate under gives a lot of the structure of the story, right? What are the things that create these conflicts? What are the things that, do I follow orders? Do I do what I think is right? How do these organizations meet and deal with civilians or with their combatants, these sorts of things? If I think about stories like the Forever War, Old Man's War, a lot of these different stories, you get to see how that military structure has a lot of an impact on the culture and the people in the story itself. So, Dennis, thinking through this, how do you view people from that kind of a naval type structure and how the interactions we see? What are the things for you that you like to see out of those characters in the story?
I think for me, it's always variety. It's always people are individuals and they act differently. And I think the best example is on Battlestar Galactica. You have almost his character, Adama, who takes his ship and he ends up deciding to protect this fleet of civilians. But then when Kane shows up, you find out that Admiral Kane had the same choice and she chose differently. And the ramifications of that and how it affects people. But for me, the biggest thing is, some people are going to do that. Some people are, it just depends on the individual, and you get all types in the military. So I like variety.
Nancy?
Well, like Dennis was saying, people don't always end up on the same side. And if people are on the same side of an issue, it's a boring story. You've got to have some disagreement in it about where you're going. And there was a series of books that I really love, and I sort of debated whether to mention them or not, because it's really not like a government navy. It's kind of a mercenary fleet that functions as a navy. And that's the Vorkosigan Chronicles, because Miles Vorkosigan's personality drives those stories. I mean, his slogan is forward momentum. And so that's always his goal. And my favorite book in the series, which people should not read first because you won't appreciate it if you read it first, you need to start at the very beginning, is Memory. Because I'm not going to spoil it, but in Memory, if you've read all those books, you can see the train wreck coming. And you understand why Miles does not see the train wreck coming. And he tends to run afoul of authority a lot with his mercenary fleet, which is, not technically a navy, I guess, because it's not under government auspices. But I really like the story. I really like the conflict. Sometimes it's sort of like if Miles were a person in this room, I would walk away. But overall, I love the character and I love the series. And over the years, Lois McMaster-Bujold has given Miles a lot of layers and a lot of different viewpoints. And he has people in his organization who go, but no, we shouldn't do that. And then they get an interesting debate. So I like the conflict and I like the variety of viewpoints, because honestly, there was a series that I used to love, which remained nameless. And I stopped reading it in part because it got to the point where I could tell who was a good guy and who was a bad guy by how they reacted to the central character. And it's like, this kind of spoiled it.
Right.
Layla?
So many books, I had to read Moby Dick. I remember growing up, and it's like so many books focus on the captain. Moby Dick was so much about the captain's ambition, and then you had Queequeg, and you had the other Ishmael. But so many stories feature the captain, and I don't think in writing as much as in movies, they really take the time to explore all the different jobs and how important every individual is when they're stationed on the ship. Everybody's got some kind of a specialty or something that they're there for. It's not random that they're there. You've got people who are trained on different equipment. People are trained on different jobs. The importance of each job and each character's place in the story gets to be explored so much more when you've got something that's central on a ship. You can move beyond the captain and the commander, and you can look at the importance of the sonar operator. You can look at the importance of, the medics, and you can look at, the navigators. Everybody's job is so dialed into what they're going to be on the ship doing that you can have so many different characters looking at it from different perspectives and how the story is affecting them. What I love is like the young lieutenant in Battleship sees his brother lose, and this is a guy that is just like, they're trying to court-martial him and get rid of him, and he ends up becoming a hero. He jumped in. He was Johnny on the spot and jumped in when those above him fell, and he went from being somebody who's about to be fired to somebody who was forced to step up and really be the next in command, because everything goes downhill. There's such a command structure that it's next man up. And you can really play on that, especially in a series, that you can take the time to show those characters develop. It's almost like watching MASH, which have been binging this week, and you see, Klinger step into Radar's position and, learn that job of clerk and take his skill set, which was different than Radar's, and see the way that both of them tackled that position while still being successful and revered for it and loved. So it's just that ability that every character, every job, every position has the ability to be special and to be focused on. You don't have to just sit there and be like the captain and the commander.
Can I speak to something that Layla said about Battleship and about Taylor Kitsch's character stepping up? There's a moment in that movie. I mean, I sort of thought, he's like, well, who's in charge? And they're like, well, all these people are dead. And he's like, who's in charge? Well, you are. He really, I think, would know that. But aside from that, his brother's ship has just been sunk. And if this is a spoiler, I'm sorry, but this movie is more than a decade old. That's just going to have to be on you. And so he wants to ram the aliens. And the chief says to him, sir, there are sailors in the water. And he brushes that aside, and the chief kind of grabs him and said, sir, there are sailors in the water. And you can see it click for him that at that moment, what he wants has to come behind getting the sailors out of the water. And to me, that was a big moment for his character in that movie.
Yeah. It's not battle or ship related, but one of my favorite character turns is God Emperor of Dune, where you go most of the book thinking that Leto II is the big bad guy. He is mostly worm, he's half insane, and there's no clue what the hell he's doing until at the end, when everything is revealed, you realize, no, he's the hero of the story, because he did what his father refused to do, and he sacrificed 3,000 years of his life in order to get this one thing done. And yeah, I love that book.
I kind of think that's what everybody's touching on that is most fun for me about these naval space navies and ocean navies types of shows and series, is that it's an ensemble cast. And I think the stories work best when they do explore more than just the captain. If it's, the captain running the show, you run out of stories very quickly. But if it's the captain plus the first officer plus the, science officer and on and on and on, you can tell endless stories. And then you have all the fanfic that follows, that everybody wants to know more stories about this side character that they saw in, a guest in episode 15 of season 30. You can have so much fun and expand the universe. And you can have endless opportunities for not just necessarily straight hardcore military sci-fi, but you can also do the comedy, like, Star Trek Strange New Worlds had the Subspace Rhapsody, which is like absolutely bonkers, and it was so fun. And then you have the whole series Lower Decks that explores another aspect about the ships that you normally wouldn't get if you were just going from the one central, captain of the ship and everything is spinning off of his point of view. So I think what I really enjoy is how diverse the genre can be with military types of books and series.
Yeah, one of my favorite episodes of B5 is one where the episode is told from the perspective of two of the maintenance crew as they're just kind of bopping along for the day. And it's like, but I will never forget they're sitting there watching the space battle go on and goes, oh, that was one of our guys. I can tell that by the color of the flash from the atmosphere in the ship. And that notion of these are the guys just trying to hold the station together going, if they fail, then everything we're doing is kind of for naught. But until then, we still got to go do our job. And there was a lot of humor, but a lot of life and reality to that interplay of watching them just kind of make their way around and we got to get out of the way of, well, that's the officers. That's this. And just the whole, we got the call. We got to go do our thing. If we look at Star Trek and the notion of, I got to go up the Jeffries tubes. Often you've got a lot that happens when you see these people that don't necessarily know what's going on other than I'm here to do my job. I got to go do my thing. And even sometimes an officer yelling at you is getting in the way of getting the job done that, if it doesn't get done, there's going to be bigger problems, and which is sometimes the fun thing as well. So Nancy, look, from that perspective, one of the other things I think is always interesting is the difference between communication, right? It's as we get into that notion of telling the stories, how much latitude does a crew have or not have? If we look at something where it is Earth-based and, you can pick up the radio and call and you can get your orders back and forth. Yeah, there can be problems in communication, but that's very different from the story where you have a Battlestar Galactica where they're out there on their own and they're having to make these decisions themselves. Or maybe you're in a position where it takes, hours, days, months, or even years, if ever, to get a message back and forth, depending on the world and the universe you're in. Star Trek kind of went and said, yeah, we're just going to create this thing and we're going to have the instant communication because we have to. But I mean, if we look at certain series, where there's this notion of communication takes time, orders are given over long periods of time. Is there something for you in these stories that you like seeing that microcosm of how much latitude or how much decisions a crew has to make versus maybe they're able to stay in touch? Think about the difference between a Voyager and an Enterprise.
I prefer the stories slightly where they're mostly out of touch. And I think I'm remembering correctly that in the Honor Harrington books, there is a communications time lag, and they make a big deal of the travel time lag as well. So even though they have faster than light travel, they remind us that faster than light travel is not instantaneous, even if someone were to send them physical orders as opposed to by radio or hyperspace link or whatever. They're not going to get them right away. And I think, I know I keep coming back to raising the stakes, but the more pressure there is on a character to make a decision, the more I feel for the character. And if it's a sympathetic character, which we would hope the protagonist would be, then I'm rooting for them harder. And now I'm worried about them because if they make the wrong decision, it's going to blow back on them. So I somewhat prefer, as I said, the ones where they are, if not completely out of touch, have a communications lag and have to make their own decisions.
Layla?
Funny that you communications because my mother was a crypto analyst. She was in naval communications all her life. She was always in a comm center. That was her job for 22 years that she served. And so when you think about the way that they had to relay things and how it changed from the 70s to the 80s to the 90s through the eras of how communications was handled and all the software that they had to learn. If you had somebody in that comm center seat that hadn't learned it correctly or wasn't translating correctly, or if something was going wrong and there was lag and they weren't getting the information that they needed from the different sources, it couldn't be relayed on time either. You had a series of people sending messages all around the world back and forth in order for an order to be made. Orders weren't never made just instantaneous. Messages had to be sent until somebody finally passed the final verdict down after getting a bunch of information from a bunch of sources and having it, decoded and translated before they can be like, you know what? Yeah, this is the order. This is what we need to do. And then they could relay it forward. So like Nancy was saying, that lag and that wait time and that understanding that you're not going to pick up a radio and have somebody on the radio on this other side be like, yeah, this is what you need to do. Because that person's got someone else that they've got to answer to. And it's, depending on the level of the situation, it's going to take some time. It's not just going to be some instantaneous, yeah, this alien popped out of the water. You want me to just nuke this thing? Yeah, okay, I'll push the button. It doesn't work that way. And I love that in naval stories, you get to see that. And you get to see just how many people go into making the decisions.
Kristin?
Yeah, I too kind of like Nancy and Layla. And by the way, the fact that your mom is a Hura is just that is absolutely cool. That is awesome. But yeah, I mean, having experience working with defense contractors and working with the Navy, like you're saying, Layla, it's just, you have a question and then it has to go to this person who then sends it to their superior, who sends it to their superior, who might be on another coast. And then you got a time lag and then it's got to filter back down through your chain of command is like, you don't really go busting around chain of command. And I think that's one thing that I always notice in whether it's a NCIS or something, that having some maverick guy going off and doing his own thing, chain of command is a little more. You would not last very long in a military scenario if you were the guy who was always just kind of taking charge and you're second lieutenant. You're not. Go set your stuff back down over there. And with communications, I too kind of prefer the ones where they're a little more cut off, and that allows people to have a lot more independent storytelling as opposed to having. I mean, if you were going to do that super real version, the guy would, okay, so we just encountered this alien planet and we're trying to think of, should we make first contact? Here, let me go put in a subspace request, which will take, a couple of days to go across. And then we'll wait a couple of days while it goes up their chain of command and comes back. Meanwhile, 2 years later. So I too kind of prefer the stories that are told where the crew has to operate with their own immediate chain of command as opposed to waiting for the higher ups back at Starfleet headquarters on Earth to do the decision making.
My dad used to call that hurry up and wait.
Yes. Yes. And with the Lost Fleet books, there's a lot of that where they talk about, okay, we're going to go across this, solar system and we're going to head for the hypergate and go to the next system within the chain. And okay, it's going to take 24 hours to get there. So it's, that sort of thing. He's, found right, storytelling shortcuts to kind of get you through those longer patches. But yeah, the fact that if you're writing for something that, having communication where you can kind of keep it local and rely on yourself is I think a little more interesting and helps speed the story along for readers, or if it's a movie, the the viewers.
I think sometimes too, people mistake that whole chain of command for looking at a ladder when it really is a circle. You've got a circle of people in this little spot who've got to go through a circle of people in the next link, who have to go through a circle of people in the next. So the ship relays it to the comm center. The comm center's got to go through their things and who to send it to next. And it really is a circle link in every bit of that chain. And that takes time. You're not just going to be like, oh, yeah, we're just going to go up one step at a time through the ladder. It does not work that way.
It took 9 months to do an annual report for the department I was working with because we had to do our own local chain of command versus then it had to go out to the West Coast and that department out there and their chain of command. And the editing back and forth took months. So I could imagine if I was, if my life is hanging on a decision and I'm out in the outer reaches of I'm out in the Oort cloud and I need something done, I need to have somebody there who can help authorize things. Because if I'm radioing back to Earth, a billion miles away, it's going to be a process. So I think, that's a shortcut. I think storytellers in science fiction and military sci-fi do, is they kind of make most commands a little more local. I'm trying to think of some examples of commands where they had to wait, years to get back to you. And I'm drawing a blank.
Well,
actually, the Robotech ones, took them 5 years when they did that warp and they ended up by Pluto. And it took them 5 years to get back. And over that time, they really became their own self-contained, entity with the commander making and his staff having to make a lot of the decisions. But then when they got close enough to Earth again, where they were actually in radio and communication contact with the rest of the fleet, it was suddenly like he went from being in charge of his ship to suddenly people telling him, you can no longer do that. You can't do this. No, you can't do that. And it really changed the shape of the story when they did reach Earth, because their whole mission was, we got to get to Earth. We got to get back to Earth. We got to tell them about the Zentradi that we've seen and all this stuff. They get there, people were reluctant to hear it. And I think, if I remember right, the attack comes before anybody's willing to listen, even though they're telling them all these things they've seen. And they're pretty much telling them, no, you need to quarantine. We're going to stick you over here. You're not leaving your ship. You're not saying anything about what's going on. We're not letting this information be shared. And all of your people who have pretty much become the city living on this carrier cannot leave, and they cannot speak to, friends and family or anyone they left behind who might still be alive, because we don't want the truth to accidentally get leaked until we figure out how we're going to deal with it.
Dennis, anything you want to put in?
Yeah, in my stories, I'm dealing with two different things. First off, there's communication between different orbital habitats. At one point, I have my main characters. They needed information from Mars, so they send in the request, and then they sit down and says, "What's the reply?" It's like, no, it's round trip is going to be 17 minutes, because Mars is close. I actually did the orbits and everything. I did a lot of research, but so there's that time delay there. But then my ships use a jump drive, which the effect of the jump drive is you're not quite in this universe, and it takes a week to get from point A to point B. Now, that means you can go from Earth to Mars in a week, but you're out of communications, and of course, communications can pass you by. The situation is a little bit different when they go to Proxima Centauri, because there you're still talking about light speed radio. There's 4-year gap. There's no communications. They are on their own, and they have to deal with fighting, and there's military going on there, which is I play with loyalty as well, because they all start as Mercor, the corporation that is your protectors, and by the end of the book, they're basically having a civil war as the corporate federation goes into its final battle. So that's all sorts of fun. But yeah, communication in space, that light speed barrier is going to not only light speed, but attenuation. When you send a radio signal out, it's not going to go forever. You're talking, just a few light years, and it's too weak. You can't hear it. So that's going to be interesting.
Are you saying that they're not watching I Love Lucy? 50.
No, it never got there. I tried to. I started writing a story. Basically, this is Rise of the Automated Empire. I have outlines for the 3 books that end the series called Fall of the Automated Empire. And I tried to write something because of where it is that they would be watching old reruns of like I Love Lucy or something like that. And after looking at the problem, I realized that no, that signal is gone. It faded into background noise by then. So, yeah.
So I'm gonna I've got 2 more questions. So the first one here is, and Layla, I'm gonna come back around to you. What's something that in kind of this naval sci-fi type of setting is something that drives you crazy? Something that every time you see it, you're like, why? Why do they keep doing this?
The biggest one is when daggone receiver and can just call and reach somebody and get an immediate response and an immediate decision. That, I think, more than anything else, drives me up the wall. And I'm like, it doesn't work that way.
You know,
I
right?
want to scream at the thing and be like, no, it doesn't, or when random person X can just jump on some piece of specialized equipment and they act like anybody can operate XYZ. And I'm like, it doesn't work that way either. MOSs are very specialized. If you are not trained on this piece of equipment, the chances of you being able to just jump on this thing and make it work and get an immediate, okay, yeah, this is fixed. No, not going to happen. I think, I was talking about MASH earlier. That was so realistic in how Klinger struggled in the beginning, that he was not just going to jump in this job. But also when Father Mulcahy mentions how, before Colonel Potter arrived, Henry Blake had to train radar because nobody just gets and sits down at a piece of equipment or a job or anything like that without the training to know what they're doing. And if they are being put in that position, they are going to need time and training to figure out all the technicalities that go with it. When you have to pull that, nobody's going to sit there and be like, oh, the code for this is this. And they're the random guy who's probably never seen the code book. No, those books that they have to open and, okay, you're giving me this information, verify it with this response. Nobody's going to have that memorized. It doesn't work that way. You got to go find that and line it up, see what day it is, see what, where your region is and what you're supposed to have. And then in this column over here, you may have your answer, or they may have changed it and your book might not be updated. And they'll be like, I don't think you're who you say you are because we changed those 3 months ago.
Yeah. Kristin, how about you? What's something that drives you nuts?
Yeah, I'd say that the same sort of thing. The story where, it's a great hero story where the ensign jumps in to save the day. But usually, just like on a film set, everything is very specialized. You have your specialty, it backwards and forwards, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the guy that's on the other side of the ship is going to be able to just jump in and save the day if you're out of commission and he has to jump in and take over your job. And there's probably also, different levels of security clearance too, depending on what the position is. So, it's fun storytelling to do that, but if it was a realistic situation, it probably would not work out that way unless the guy was literally the last person alive on the ship and he's got to figure out how to save himself.
At the very least, hook me up with a backstory that, like, maybe this guy, was in this position on another vessel or something, and he's been trained in something else now, but he has that to fall back on. But give me that in the backstory before he just jumps up there and saves the day. Let me know that he's at least got some form of training, or he didn't finish a school, but he's got just enough. He got through just far enough that he can be passable on this. He can maybe make it work for you, but he's not going to be the perfect person for it. But he's the only guy that is, he's at least had a couple weeks of training on it. You know, something. Give me something.
Dennis, how about you? What drives you crazy?
I got a laundry list. I mean, I've already covered the lack of promotions and realistic crew rotations on Star Trek. And also, like when Kirk and company took over a Klingon battleship, you're talking, this is an alien species with an alien language, and they walk in, take over the ship, and fly it home. No. The other thing is, in almost every space battle that we see, there are close-up fighters doing dog maneuvers and, you know, back and forth. Your realistic battle is not going to be lasers at, you know, close distance. You fire a laser at somebody and they're just doing these little jig-jags to get out of the way. You're not going to hit them. You need missiles and drones that can get them, and you launch them from vast distances and then try to get out of range. You know, battles in space are going to be very, very different than what pop culture likes to display them. So yeah, that's
the Lost Fleet. They use rocks. They drop. They're called rocks. You know, just very heavy, dense, you know, rocks of metal and chunks of metal, and they just launch them at a planet, and so the planet, you know, it's like nuclear explosions by the time that, you know, they reach atmosphere and destroy a city. It's not lasers. It's
right.
They launch or grape shot.
Yeah, I still remember the look of shock on the faces of the people at NASA when they figured out that even styrofoam fired at 500 miles per hour at something can do major damage. And I'm like, duh.
It's moving at 500 miles an hour.
Right.
Like
they didn't flying at 18,000 miles an hour in orbit.
In orbit, it's going to be much, much worse. You're going to be shooting bullets, and it's going to take out starships and habitats. And that's actually something that I deal with in my book, is that it doesn't take much to destroy some of these habitats because they weren't built with armor. You know, they've got like defensive for like little asteroids and stuff. But you start launching missiles at them, and you're killing tens of thousands of people.
Well, that's one of the things from The Expanse I thought they handled pretty well as well.
Yeah, The Expanse did it really well. In fact, The Expanse space battles were some of the best, I think.
That whole bit about Kirk and them getting on the Klingon vessel and taking, I would have loved to have seen them have to just struggle to find the freaking start button. Like, how do we even, you know, you can't, who could read Klingon? Like, no one was just going to sit down at a station that is entirely in Klingon.
I could buy if Spock knew Klingon. I could buy that.
Yes.
But McCoy?
No.
No.
I'm a doctor. Well, never mind.
Right.
Yeah.
Nancy, how about
I'm a
you?
doctor, not a Klingon.
My problem with a lot of things is kind of different. And it's not just with naval military stories. It's when a character goes off half-cocked like a loose cannon, and there are no repercussions for it. Right. I watched a first episode of a series, and this may be a difference between how the military really works and what I, never having been in the military, expect of it. But it seems to me that if you disobey a direct order and you are confined to your quarters, and then you come out of your quarters because there is some kind of emergency on board without anyone's approval, just because you think you're the person to handle it, I want to see either repercussions or an explanation of why there are no repercussions. Like Layla was saying, Taylor Kitsch's character, Hopper, was about to get kicked out of the Navy because, hey, loose cannon and a little bit of an asshole. But Hopper kind of saves the world. And so from that standpoint, we can see why Hopper does not end up in the nearest brig. But he was headed that way when the movie started. And when I see a character go off like that, I'm just thinking, I thought direct orders were supposed to be obeyed, and I didn't think you got to determine when there was an exception to when you did that. So that just flies all over me when people do that. All I want's an explanation. That's all I want. But if that happens and there's no explanation for why the character is not in deep patootie, then I'm irritated.
Babylon 5 did that really well with the president saying that half of the people wanted him to have a medal and the other half wanted him shot. So by all means, they should give him a medal and then shoot him.
So, I mean, there's always a ton of things that we could dive into just to get deeper in the details. But this is your opportunity to say, what's something we haven't talked about you think we need to? So, Kristin, this comes to you first.
One thing that I really was fascinated by, the Foreigner series of books by C.J. Ria. I'm not sure how to pronounce her last name. But that long series of books that she's been writing since, the 1970s or whenever. But one of the scenarios, one of the events that happens in the story is that this planet with the Atavi and humans gets revisited by the the ship that dropped them off there in the first place. It had dropped them off and then took a U-turn and then went off and did its own thing. And then it comes back, in the future, and it's like, hey guys, here we are. But what was interesting was, here's this Navy ship and it's out in the middle of, deep space. And over the generations, it kind of developed its own culture and its own mythology. And so that kind of a subject that fascinates me. If you are out there in deep space in a future Star Trek Federation universe or a future, a space fleet, Space Force, and you're out there in a generational capacity, I mean, what sort of, would you still end up like you started out with the people? Would you still have the chain of command? Would it become hereditary, where it's, not your capability, but because you were the descendant of the original captain? That's kind of fascinating. I'd like to see more of that.
That's a great idea.
Dennis, how about you? What have we hit on that you think we ought to touch on?
Well, what happens, and this is something I've got a novel in the works that I'm working on that addresses this or tries to. And what happens when you send a military ship as your exploration and it's got a military structure and you get someplace and start setting up a colony? How do you transition from military rule to civilian rule, especially when what you were expecting to find is not what you got into and things don't go right? How much, and I play with the tension between the civilian and the military, but this trip has taken them 7 years to get from point A to point B. So some of that military structure has already broken down. Some of it they're very informal now, because 7 years is a long time. And yeah, he's not captain anymore. You're just calling him Skip, and he's more like Grandpa.
Yeah, and in fact, later on in Scalzi's Old Man War series, there's actually one where they kind of address some of that too.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and off of what Dennis said too, when you do an exploration trope and you have the military chain of command, but you also have the science crew, what happens when they get set up somewhere underwater? They get out in the middle of nowhere and they encounter that creature, that living creature. It's not technology. So then who do you defer to? Who is now in charge? Is it still under the captain, who might understand how to deal with the technology if they're facing, another battleship or a kaiju coming up or some weird thing, or if you're dealing with the scientist? And I think Pacific Rim really played with that a lot, because those two scientists who everyone pretty much was like, they're kind of crazy and but they really needed to listen to those scientists more, because the scientists were figuring out communications, and they were figuring out all the parts that, here you've got them lobbing the mechs at them and lobbing missiles at them. And hey, if it took figuring out the science of drifting and the science of how these were communicating before they could really get through the breach and sort everything out. The scientists were the ones that really made that possible. It wasn't the technology.
Especially when you're putting lasers on the sharks' heads.
Yeah.
Hey, can I throw another pet peeve out there?
Oh, sure.
Landing on a planet and being able to breathe the air with no problem.
Yes.
I'll give you that. But then being able to touch the plants, eat the plants, survive on the local flora and fauna. It's like,
I want to see the plant just wrap around someone's leg and try to eat them. Like, they go to try to pick and eat this plant, and the plant's just like, yeah, no, not on this planet.
None of the proteins would be digestible. None of them would be. If your squid plant ate somebody, it would either get really sick or die.
Wasn't that
that's how I ended up with steampunk dinosaurs with explosive diarrhea.
Ooh, I like that.
Well, wasn't that was it the episode A Taste of Eden in the original Star Trek series?
Yes.
Yeah, Taste of Eden. Yeah, and it was all acid and poison, and they all died.
that was more realistic of a planet, even if it's not instantly toxic like that, you're not going to be able to digest the proteins unless you change your gut flora, which is a whole conversation that I've never seen happen in a science fiction show.
Nancy, what's your pet peeve?
Well, it's not a pet peeve so much as something that we really haven't talked about, and that is kind of ties in with what everybody else has been talking about, which is first contact protocols. I'd like the story to have protocols for first contact, especially in a science fiction one where you're more likely to meet a strange new species. But what Layla was talking about earlier about how you don't know what's down there, I read a really good book by Susan Casey called Underworld, and it's about the exploration of the depths of the ocean and what lives down there and how do you get down there. And one of the points it makes is, like Layla was saying, is, yeah, we've seen some life forms down here. We don't know which ones are down here that we haven't seen yet. And so I sort of think anybody who's on an exploration mission or a mission that's going to take them into unfamiliar territory with unfamiliar cultures needs a first contact protocol. The Speaker for All is an ocean story, and it's a first contact story. So I've been thinking a lot about how that might work. And it bothers me when in a story, whether it's military or other, and no apparent thought has been given to that.
So, Layla, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I think we've covered quite a lot tonight.
Well, before we set this ship to sail, let's make sure everybody knows where to find you guys. Website, social media, and of course, if there happens to be that book that they need to pick up along the way as well. So, Layla?
You can find me at Layla Dorine at Wix.com. You can find me at Rainbow Lyrics and Mellow Mushrooms. Facebook, way too much. And now, as of yesterday, Blue Sky as well. I have 2 Christmas books coming out, and that's about it for the rest of the year.
Kristin?
I guess technically you can still find me on Twitter at AnnieCat. I'm hardly there anymore, though. Mostly on, I guess, Facebook more often. But yeah, just hanging out, doing some stuff, hoping that some of my friends who went to the AFM, the American Film Market, this last week will come back having sold some series and feature films that I can participate in next year. So anyway, that's about it.
Dennis?
You can find me at automatedempire.com. All of my social media are there, and my newsletter. Oh, and the merch store. See the beautiful new t-shirt I got. And my books are available on Amazon.com. Yeah, come find me.
Nancy?
My website is nancynorthcott.com. All my social media is there except for Blue Sky, where I too have become much more active in the past couple of days. The Speaker for All and Eden's Secret in the Outcast Station series will be out early next year. My most recent release is a short story in a historical fiction anthology that's a tribute to Richard III, who was not, in fact, an evil, power-hungry madman, but I could do a whole panel on that by myself, so I won't. But it's a short story about Edward IV, Richard Gloucester, as he was then, and their brother George, Duke of Clarence, getting together after a very difficult family moment. And that's available now, and it's in Kindle Unlimited.
And you can find me at jamespnettles.com, authoressentialsworkshops.com, creatingprose.com, and of course here at ConTinual. And we'll see you guys again soon. Set course for that first start of the right.